Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher. I'm doing the commentary for this one in post, which isn't something I usually like to do, but I found several problems while I was playing the Feral Druid DPS, which made me sort of want to rethink it. I ran lots of dungeons with the cat, about 4 or 5 I would say. It was quite a long day of doing Druid stuff, and I felt that one, my commentary wasn't good enough while I was playing this one, which was a certain issue for keeping a quality on the kind of videos that I'm talking about. Plus, there were several issues I wanted to talk about more in depth, which was difficult while I was trying to maneuver and do everything while I was playing. The first thing you're going to notice is, obviously, AOE DPS is awesome. A combination of keeping Thrash on the targets and swiping with the combo points to keep up Savage Roar and all that kind of good stuff. And then getting the Predatory Strikes buff, which you'll see on a pretty regular basis, allowed for just some really, really consistent, constant, permanent AOE DPS. So there was no issue there. You can see it's well over 100k while I was doing this trash. The main problems of this that I ran into was that Shred and its positional requirement, especially while you're doing your learning, which is in the 5-man dungeons. Let's face facts, the time you get to actually do some DPS is in the 5-man dungeons, was actually just really, really frustrating in order to get really nice, consistent DPS. Mobs died far too quickly. Getting things like Rip-On was just a complete waste of time, and it was moving more towards just ferocious biting things, essentially, which wasn't what I wanted to demonstrate. And this continued to happen throughout the dungeon. It was just very, very difficult for me to portray a nice, accurate style of what the Feral Cat is all about. Combined with this was the Dream of Cenarius buff, which is a nice, consistent damage buff, which is actually in good shape. You can see I'm using it on a pretty regular basis. And when it comes to actually putting off a single target rotation, difficulties can really arise, especially when you've got tanks that aren't really keeping mobs in the same position, is what I want to say. Keeping mobs in one position is very important to a cat. Otherwise, you're having to make a lot of decisions on the fly between, am I shredding or am I mangling? And that's not a decision we want to make while we're DPSing. I don't feel it's the case. It was an issue I ran into and I'd forgotten about more during Wrath of the Lich King when I played a Feral Druid main, is I was lucky enough to play with good tanks. If I wasn't tanking myself, I was playing with a very good tank who was aware that being behind the mob is actually very, very important. As such, keeping a mob still is equally as important. Now, this was an issue that I ran into a lot, and this one really demonstrated it the most was this boss, is I was blowing a lot of cooldowns to try and show really impressive DPS, which didn't quite work. You'll notice my energy gets very, very high, very, very regularly, and I'm permanently having to adjust my position. You can see how much I'm moving around. Right now, you can see how much I'm having to move around to find a good shred position. Now, a couple of things that could be contributing towards this. One is certainly my UI is turned up to max. Everything is maximized to make the video quality the best, which is actually derogatory towards my DPS, unfortunately, when there's lots of things going on. Especially when the floor is covered in this, and an undead mob in particular, like this boss is, being permanently small, really caused this issue to be more prevalent. I did manage to get to the top of the DPS, which isn't something I expected to do after starting so poorly on this boss and not having any DPS cooldowns up. And then it just graduated from there. So it's this issue that I wanted to talk about more in depth, is Mangle and Shred, and this positional requirement thing. Positional requirements are something that I think Blizzard is good on paper. Alright, you understand what I'm saying? It's good on paper, is this we're shredding people in the back. It sounds really cool. Practically, though, it's actually a huge pain in the ass. And it does cause its suffering for Feral Druids, and has done over previous expansions, is when they just couldn't shred. We look at bosses like Colligan, for example, and his 2 arms, which could not be DPS from the front, effectively by a Feral Druid. I was a Feral Druid during the progress of that fight. And as such, my DPS was horrendous. I was brought along as a good player. It was a good, consistent player who we wanted in our raids. And it's very nice to be in that position where you are asked to come because it's you, which is cool. We want you in the raid, and I've always been in that sort of position. However, being in that position and doing terrible DPS makes you obviously aware that if there was another player who was equally as good overall, would be better than you being there. And this issue is still prevalent to this day, and I don't believe it should be. Rogues are suffering a little bit from this with Subtlety, with Backstab and Hemorrhage being in a similar sort of situation. But the other 2 specs have been completely changed to make sure that they can have things like Dispatch for Assassination, which attacks from any direction whatsoever. I think we've gone past the time where positional requirements should be a part of the game. I don't think they're very useful whatsoever. I think they're actually holding back the class in some instances. It's not too bad in the raids. Not too bad in the raids, but you can see how much I'm having to move constantly during this one encounter simply to try and get behind the target. Not something I really wanted to be a part of. The next thing is utility I wanted to speak about, and this trash kind of demonstrated for that. If I was on my DPS warrior right now, I would have various other tools in order to help this guy out. This DK tank was not the best. As you can see, he's death gripping a singular mob instead of trying to get us near all the mobs, which are now freely casting at the healer. As such, I move in to try and steal some aggro effectively. This was my decision process. Is the tank is tanking a singular mob. He hasn't even dropped maybe a death and decay on the rest of the mobs. Therefore, the healer's getting bashed. You can see the group and the healers are starting to really suffer. As such, I move in and start doing DPS. You can see my DPS goes through the roof as being the first to AoE, and I'm trying desperately to pull aggro away. Now, my utility in these situations is actually very weak. I could use the shout, which disorientates things. I didn't carry it in this dungeon, but even then, that's only an interrupt. It's not a silence. It wouldn't help gather the mobs, which is something I could do on, say, my DPS warrior, or any other things like that. I could use, if I was a DK, I could use my AoE death grip. I could use all sorts of things to aid in this situation, and to try and help the group out, which is something I think is missing. Besides the healing from predatory strikes, where we can consistently heal the rest of the group, which is awesome, we lack actual utility to help control and manage situations that get out of hand very, very quickly. That is something I really, really dislike, is that situation. I really dislike the utility that comes from being a feral cat. Not only are we hindered by this backwards attacking, we're also hindered by our lack of utility in bad situations. Sure, we've got Rebirth and Tranquility, which are all very well and good, and powerful when used in the right situations. But our ability to actually control a situation getting out of hand, again, this tank would refuse, absolutely refuse to tank this trash, which is pulled as soon as you go round this corner. And I forced him again. You can see here again, he just death grips the first mob. I like the fact that on most of my characters, I can do something here to really help out. A nice example was on the Enhancement Shaman in Scarlet Monastery, when we had a similar sort of situation come up. I could hex things, I could start interrupting, I used grounding totems, all sorts of things to really help the group out. It made me very frustrated. Now, usually I would, in essence, cut this video and show you a different one where I owned the DPS. There are several videos like that I recorded of the feral cat, of me just wiping the DPS with the floor where I could do easy DPS. But I actually prefer to show you the problems and the things that cause me issue. This is a very old school line of thinking, and in a game that is being more homogenized, I feel feral druids need more utility in handling dangerous group situations and rescuing almost certain death. If it wasn't for the fact that this DK accidentally moved out of line of sight of a lot of these mobs, then we would have had another wipe here, and I could have done nothing about it. Now, there's another aspect to this. Should every player be able to resolve situations? I think there should be something that helps situations out. It's all very well and good just giving tanks more threat, or giving tanks the ability to do tremendous numbers, so that if we have a really bad DPS, the tank can help out. That's fine. Making healing relatively easily in the normal modes, or heroic modes if you want to call them that, is fine. But utility is far more important. Especially when you compare it to something like a rogue or a feral druid who could mass stealth there. We wouldn't have pulled it. If we had a tank who was determined to not pull trash that most certainly will pull, we could use AoE stealth and then avoid that situation entirely. As a feral druid, I can't do any of those things. I could AoE interrupt them on my prot warrior. I could use a Ring of Frost on a mage, so on and so forth. A million tools and utilities that could have really helped the situation out. Be it the fact that I can cycle on a mob for a few seconds and then release it is not exactly ideal. Again, on this boss, it runs the same situation as this boss constantly moves around. He's in a fixed position and he's randomly moving around the place to cast spells at people. This makes shredding really, really annoying, and it just hinders the class. And then you run into situations where your spells are not working and you have to then go, oh crap, I'm behind the mob. I either move or I start using mangle, and then my DPS suffers even more, which is not something I particularly enjoy. Although the cat is quite a fun spec, I think the prevalence of some sort of healing contribution, especially if something like Heart of the Wild becomes the #1 spec and we have to be casting Wrath at the beginning of a fight, as we almost have to do now. We're almost there now, and it's quite possible it will take over again in the future with some minor changes. That's not cool. That's not what I wanted to play with my melee class. If I wanted to cast Wrath, I would be a Moonkin. That is just it. I think this spec has a number of issues that need resolving rather quickly, and it kind of irritated me a lot to do this and switching between them. I think energy cost and the fact that hit and expertise are so minor is something the Rogue has moved away from. Let's face facts, the Feral Druid was based on the Rogue, and they decided not having energy all the time is really annoying. It's really quite annoying, but Feral Druids have very high energy costs for their abilities, and their energy isn't regenerating incredibly quickly, to the point where we can afford to miss. We can afford to not have hit and expertise. We just want to eventually get our spells on, and if we don't make contact, it's not a problem. We're not going to lose DPS because our energy regen's so low. Ignore the fact that I just blew every cooldown under the sun to do mass damage and got teleported out of the dungeon. So that's why I wanted to do it over in post. There's some Feral Druid gameplay for you. I hope some of you are enjoying the Feral Druid. That was my thoughts. I think there's a lot of queries there that need to be answered. I think this needs a little bit of a rework. I would certainly prefer Shred to just replace Mangle, essentially, and just be the attack of Feral Druids. Would be able to step in the right direction and a bit more utility. Alright, ballers, you take it easy.